The title of our paper was Sugar-sweetened and artificially sweetened beverage consumption and risk of type 2 diabetes in men. But before we get into the paper, let's talk about the issues the paper attempted to address. Diabetes is a major driver of morbidity and healthcare costs in the United States. The American Diabetes Association estimated total costs associated with diabetes at $245 billion in 2012. $322 billion if you include patients diagnosed with prediabetes. Nearly 30 million Americans suffer from diabetes, and that number is steadily increasing. Minorities are disproportionately affected, both because of socioeconomic and biologic reasons. The most affected minorities include American Indians, Blacks, and Hispanics. As the rate of diabetes and obesity have increased in the United States, the rate of sugar-sweetened beverages has gone up in parallel. We know that sugar-sweetened beverages have a lot of calories with little nutritional content, and a major question in public health is, has the increase in sugar-sweetened beverages over the last several decades played a causative role in the current obesity and diabetes epidemic facing the United States? After all, cell phone use has also gone up during this period, but no one thinks cell phone use causes diabetes. The question is not just academic. If sugar-sweetened beverage consumption causes diabetes and obesity in the way that smoking causes lung cancer, a public health response might involve taxing these beverages in an effort to decrease their consumption. At the time of this study was being performed, there was a lot of interest in imposing taxes on sugar-sweetened beverages as a means of improving health. A paper published in the New England Journal of Medicine in 2009 found that while 33 states had sales taxes on soft drinks, those taxes were too small to affect consumption. Many legislatures at the time were debating imposing taxes on sugary drinks as a means of combating obesity. New York City's effort to regulate large sugary beverages was an example that made nationwide news. When Lawrence de Koning and his colleagues decided to look into this issue, several others had already looked at the relationship between diabetes and food and beverage consumption. Past research has generally associated both sugar and artificially sweetened beverage consumption and diabetes. Coffee has previously been suggested to be protective, and results with juice are mixed. So what does this study add? This study followed a large group, there were over 50,000 men in the underlying population, for 20 years to observe, among other things, the development of diabetes and risk factors associated with it. This large sample size and close following allowed them to control for confounders missed in other studies. For example, in the previous studies associating artificially sweetened beverages with type 2 diabetes and metabolic syndrome, there was no controlling for pre-existing increased risk of type 2 diabetes, which could have been a factor driving people to consume more artificially sweetened beverages as an alternative to sugary beverages. Additionally, this study compared the effects of both beverage types in the same population, which put it in a stronger position to advocate for switching beverage consumption preferences if the data warranted. So who exactly was in this health professionals follow-up study, and why was it started? The HPF-US is a large prospective cohort study sponsored by the Harvard School of Public Health and the National Cancer Institute, with the aim of studying the relationship of nutritional factors to the incidence of serious illness in men, including cancer, heart disease, and other vascular diseases. Since its inception, over 100 papers have been published using this study cohort. This is a large study population, with over 51,000 men enrolled, and over 93% of those still actively participating. The study population is made up of health professionals, including dentists, pharmacists, optometrists, osteopath physicians, podiatrists, and veterinarians, groups that the original principal investigators thought would be committed to a long-term participation in a cohort study. The cohort is overwhelmingly white, with only 1% of the cohort being African American and 1.7% being Asian American. There is no Latino representation. By design, this is an all-male cohort, with the idea being that this study would complement the all-female nurses' health study. For this study, the researchers excluded participants with previously diagnosed type 2 diabetes, previously diagnosed cardiovascular disease such as heart attack, stroke, angina, coronary artery bypass graft, or cancer, except non-melanoma skin cancer. Individuals who reported implausible energy intake, say less than 800 calories a day or more than 4,200 calories a day at baseline, were also excluded. Looking at the study population as a whole, the average participant consumed, on average, 2.5 sugary beverages per week and 3.5 artificially sweetened beverages. Of course, most probably had a preference for one over the other. Diabetes was present in 3.5% of the population at the start of the study, according to another study from the HPF-US. Remember, these were excluded from our study. The incidence of diabetes over the 20 years of the study ended up being 5.2%. The study population actually tended to have lower rates of diabetes than the rest of the population of similarly aged men. Again, to explicitly state the objective of this study, it was to look at the association between consumption of sugar-sweetened and artificially sweetened beverages and the incidence of type 2 diabetes in a specific patient population. Other commonly encountered beverage types were also assessed. The researchers primarily focused on the exposures of sugar-sweetened beverages and artificially sweetened beverages. Consumption was measured in terms of usual intake, as assessed by a food frequency questionnaire administered every 4 years. The outcome of interest was type 2 diabetes, measured by a supplementary questionnaire mailed to the participants. These responses were confirmed in 97% of cases by medical record review in a validation study. In any study looking to elucidate cause and effect, perhaps the most important baseline question to be answered prior to formulating any conclusion is, did the exposure of interest, in this case sugar-sweetened, artificially sweetened beverage consumption, occur before the outcome of interest, in this case the development of type 2 diabetes? In order to ensure that exposure happened before outcome, the authors excluded participants who had a diagnosis of type 2 diabetes at the beginning of the study. They also performed a sub-analysis in which they excluded study participants who were diagnosed with type 2 diabetes during the first 2 years of the study period. This sub-analysis did not produce significantly different results than the overall analysis, indicating the results of the study were not skewed by early type 2 diabetes cases that could not reasonably be affected by beverage consumption during the early period of the study. A slew of additional variables beyond sweetened beverage intake were also recorded, including different types of energy intake, total energy intake, weight change in 5-year period prior to the study onset, low-calorie diet in 1994, body mass index, smoking, physical activity, family history of type 2 diabetes, multivitamin use in 1988, high triglycerides, high blood pressure, and diuretic use. As diabetes is a multifactorial disease and there are many sources of sugar in the modern diet, the authors were neither postulating that sugar-sweetened or artificially sweetened beverages are necessary or sufficient causes of diabetes, because the questionnaires filled out by the study participants were so detailed, the researchers were able to include more than a dozen covariates and attempt to determine whether the sweetened beverages had a real association with diabetes. In the fully adjusted models, intake of sugar-sweetened beverages was significantly associated with increased risk of type 2 diabetes, with a hazard ratio of 1.24. Cola was the most commonly consumed sugary sweetened beverage. Artificially sweetened beverage consumption was not significantly associated with increased type 2 diabetes risk, with a hazard ratio of 1.09. Insufficient data was available in the paper to see a dose-response relationship in number of sugar-sweetened beverages and development of diabetes. With what data that was available, we can only tell that above the threshold of 4.5 sugary drinks per week, there is an increased risk of type 2 diabetes. Other interesting results include that coffee is protective and there is no association between diabetes and fruit punch, lemonade, milk, tea, and fruit juice after controlling for confounders. Several of the covariates measured in the study were possible confounders, including smoking, physical activity, alcohol intake, family type 2 diabetes history, high triglycerides at the start of the study, hypertension, multivitamin intake, and total energy intake. As a reminder, confounders are factors that go along with the exposure of interest, are known to cause or protect against the outcome of interest, and therefore may distort the true association or lack thereof between the exposure and the outcome. In this study, the concern arises that sweetened beverage consumption might go along with unhealthy habits such as smoking or alcohol intake. Since we know these factors increase the risk of diabetes, these confounders might create an apparent association between sweetened beverage consumption and diabetes when there is no true association. By contrast, artificially sweetened beverage consumption might go along with healthy habits such as a low-calorie diet or good diet quality. If we assume that people drinking artificially sweetened beverages are doing so in an effort to be healthier, if this were the case, then confounders such as good diet might mask an association between artificially sweetened beverage intake and diabetes. Good diet protects against diabetes, beverage consumption causes diabetes. Combined, it looks like no association. Since the researchers were using data from a cohort study which they did not design, they could not control for these potential confounders in the design portion of the study. Instead, they controlled for them in the analysis portion, using regression analysis. Like confounding, selection bias can alter results in undesirable ways as well. Selection bias is when there are inherent differences in the two different exposure groups that may bias the outcome. It is problematic in observational studies. The authors of this study dealt with this in two ways. They excluded individuals with comorbidities which may have affected their choices of beverage and/or their likelihood of developing diabetes. For example, an obese person may be more likely to select artificially sweet beverages in order to lose weight, and having more obese patients in one group than another may bias outcomes. They also controlled for other factors which could have caused confounding, as was discussed in the previous slide. One of the justifications of the HPF-US population was that health professionals might be expected to have low rates of loss to follow-up, which was indeed true, as 93% of the overall study population stayed in it throughout this study. However, although the authors didn't discuss it, if we thought one group would drop out at a lower rate, we would expect it to be the group consuming non-sugar-sweetened beverages. The study found these participants to generally be more involved in health improvement activities, so they might be more interested in remaining in this study. The study also investigated whether age, alcohol consumption, type 2 diabetes, family history, or physical activity could interact with sugary beverage consumption in a way that affects the incidence of type 2 diabetes. By stratifying by each of these variables, the investigators tested additional hypotheses, including, is there a subset of the study population for which elevated sugary beverage consumption intake and alcohol consumption is necessary for the development of type 2 diabetes, or a subset of which sugary beverages and advanced age are necessary? Had effect modification been observed, it could have led to new hypotheses about the biological mechanism of the development of type 2 diabetes. However, the investigators concluded that there was no significant interaction between these variables and sugary beverage intake in the study population. The study had many strengths. Because beverage consumption was assessed before type 2 diabetes was developed, this helped avoid the potential concern of recall bias. Because all the members of the population were in a similar socioeconomic class, this reduced the possibility of confounding. Long-term measurement of beverage intake helps reduce the error in measurements from only a few data points, and close controlling for multiple confounders in a large sample size are also incredibly good. Another strength is that many different types of beverages, not just sugar-sweetened beverages or artificially sweetened beverages, were assessed in this study, since beverage choices are not binary. There were also some weaknesses in this study, some of which the authors mentioned. Poor generalizability perhaps being at the top of the list, which we'll talk about more in the next slide. There's also always a concern about unmeasured residual confounding, which is a problem in all observational studies, no matter the attempt to control for confounding. Another weakness is that there was no loss to follow-up analysis, which could have helped in ruling that out as a source of bias. What we know about pathophysiology and what we've learned from other in vitro experiments and population studies lend consistency, plausibility, and coherence to the link between sugar consumption and diabetes development. The study design was carefully done to ensure temporality, which of course is required but does not guarantee causality. The strength of correlation is not very strong, but a 24% increase in risk of diabetes could be significant in certain populations. With simple analyses, biological gradient could also be explored. The nature of the study makes it difficult to allow experimental modification of exposures and sufficient monitoring of all possible exposures to ensure specificity. Even so, given all this, it's reasonable to conclude that there is evidence supporting the claim that there is a causal link between sugar-sweetened beverages and type 2 diabetes. Now, about generalizability. The study cohort is composed of mostly white male health professionals, demographic and behavioral characteristics that differ from the general population and from those most affected by diabetes. For example, race. Evidence shows that sugar-sweetened beverage consumption and diabetes prevalence are higher among minority populations, but the vast majority of the HPF-US cohort is white. Socioeconomic status. Health professionals make more money than other professionals or working class groups, and many come from economically higher social classes. In general, higher socioeconomic status is associated with more health-conscious behavior. Education. Of course, health professionals have more education than your average member of the population, and they also have more health-related knowledge. And finally, age. Health professionals are an older group of adults having spent early adulthood completing graduate education. This means that their metabolic functions may perform differently than younger adults, adolescents, or children. The fact that this cohort differs so starkly from general population, and the population most likely to be affected by diabetes, raises questions regarding external validity, that is, who can we generalize this study to? The results of this study cannot be generalized, for example, to women, to minority populations, to populations with lower socioeconomic status, to less educated populations, or younger adults, adolescents, and children. So, was this study worthwhile? We as a group have concluded, yes, we think it was worthwhile. After all, it established a link between sugar-sweetened beverages and diabetes risk among this admittedly low-risk population. Now, this association has been shown among a low-risk population. Follow-up studies among more at-risk populations can and should explore whether and how the association applies to other affected populations. Thanks for paying attention. We hope you learned something.